Hi guys, welcome back to the next lesson. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at using the React Context API. We're going to set up our global context to allow for state management across our application. To do that, we're going to create our global context. We're going to define the reducers and the actions, and then we're going to import the context into our application. So if you aren't aware of what the React Context API is or what state management is, state management basically allows us to access variables and state in any component within our application. Other kind of popular state management options are stuff like Redux. Redux is probably the most common one other than the Global Context API. Redux used to be the only proper state management option until recently when React released the Context API. So we're going to move back over to our application. We've got our dummy components that we built last time. We're just going to close all of these for now. We don't need access to them because in this lesson we're going to pretty much solely concentrate on the context. So I'm going to make a new folder. It's going to be called context. Inside that folder, I'm going to create a new file called global context.js. And for now, when we create this context, we're going to concentrate primarily on authorization. We will add to that when we go on. We'll add to it to handle removing to-dos and adding to-dos. But for now, we're going to concentrate on authorization. So what we're going to do is we're going to import React, and then we're going to do comma, and we're going to do curly braces. We're also going to import create context, comma, use context, comma, use reducer, comma, use effect, and then outside of the curly brackets from React. We also want to import Axios. From Axios, we installed Axios earlier. It's a package to basically make a HTTP requests. And we're going to make HTTP requests to our backend. So when we're creating global context, we need to define our initial state. So our initial state is basically what we want in our state object. So our const initial state is going to be equal to curly brackets. We're going to have a user property that's going to be set to null by default. So initial state is what we want our state to be at the start of the application. Fetching user is true. So we're going to basically be fetching the user, and then we're going to set that to false once we fetch the user. Complete to-dos, and that's going to be an empty array, and incomplete to-dos, which is also going to be an empty array. So that's going to define our initial state for now. I don't know if we're going to add to that. We might add to that further down the line. But we then also need our reducer. So a reducer basically tells us how to interact with this state, what to set our state object to. So for now, we're just going to do const global reducer is equal to, and then curly, we're going to make an arrow function, which is going to take the parameters of state, comma, and action. And for now, and then we're going to do a switch. Inside here will be a big switch. It will be a switch with round brackets, action.type. And then we're going to have a load of cases in here where we'll tell the state. We'll basically describe how we want to manipulate the state is the right word to say it. But for now, we're just going to do a default response out of our global reducer of return state. So that's a default colon and then a new space, a new line, return state. So that'll do it for now for the global reducer. We'll definitely be adding to that in this episode. We then need to create the context. Export const global context. So we need to export this variable because we'll be using it elsewhere in our application. And it's going to be equal to create context. So the React hook create context. And we're going to use the initial state. We then need to make a provider. So we need to make a provider component. So to do that, we're going to do export const. It's going to be an arrow function. It's going to be global provider. And that's going to take in, it's going to be an arrow function which takes in props. And inside of that, we are going to make use of the reducer. So to do that, we need to do const and then square bracket state, comma, dispatch. equals use reducer. So this is wiring up our reducer. We're going to have the global reducer as our parameter there, comma initial state. So we're wiring up our reducer now. Inside of here, we're going to have a load of actions. So our actions are going to be stuff like so action is going to be get current user, stuff like actions for logging out and whatnot. I'm just going to put a comment there now because we're going to handle that later on. But we then need to output and we then need to return from this component. So this is just a normal React-based component really. And it's going to be global. We're going to output arrow global context dot provider. And then value is equal to, we're going to pass something into that value soon. And then inside of this component we're using here, that provider needs to be a capital P. Let's fix that typo there. We're then going to output props.children. So we'll end up using this global context. We'll wrap our whole application in this global context element, which means we need to render the props.children to render any children inside of there. So we're going to create the value up here. So const value equals, and from that value, we just need to return the state so that we can access the state from our global context provider. So we're just going to spread the state. That's what that 3 dots means there. So we're spreading the state. And when we create actions in here, we'll also need to add them to the value object. And then we can pass in value equals value here. We're also going to export a function. So export function, use global context, round brackets. So this is going to be a context. We're basically creating our own hook here, which is going to be return use context, global context. So this is basically what we'll use. We'll use a React hook inside of our other components to easily grab actions and values in the state from our using our use global context hook here. So that's the basic setup. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go to app.js. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import the provider here. So import global provider in curly braces from /context/global context. So the provider basically is what's providing the whole of our application with our state. So inside the return, I'm going to move that to a new line. I'm going to open up round brackets. I'm going to move our layout into here. Above the layout, I'm going to use a global provider. I'm going to output our global provider. So we've got a global provider tag there, and I'm going to move the layout inside of that global provider. So what that's doing is basically wrapping our whole application inside of our layout. Okay, so we've got a few warning errors here. That's just because we haven't used some of the stuff we've assigned in our global context. We can ignore that for now. So so we've got our initial state here. I'm just going to give an example of and show you inside of our browser here what state does and how it makes it more accessible. So I'm going to right click and inspect. I have React DevTools installed. I'd highly recommend you installing React DevTools. It's not going to work right now, is it? Let me refresh the page. I'm in an incognito browser, which means that I don't have access to DevTools. I'll pause this and I'll make sure we have access to DevTools. I'll bring open a new browser, which isn't incognito. Okay, so I've just continued the recording. I've now opened up this where we've got access to the React DevTools Chrome extension. So you can now see our global provider is here. On side of our provider, I'm basically in the React DevTools as the components tab in React DevTools that allows us to basically see the components inside of our application. We've got the context.provider here. This is the provider we've just created, and you can see the value has our state on it here. This is then all the other components are children of this context provider, and therefore we can access the state inside of those children when we need to. So I'm going to close this off, and I'm going to go back to our global context, and I'm going to make some changes inside of that global context to get us ready to allow for authorization. So if I go back to global context here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new action, and that action is going to be a function which is called const get current user. And what this function is going to do is it's going to get all the data we need when we think a user is logged in. So it's going to be an async function. It's an async arrow function. We're going to make a try catch as we always do. And for now, we're just going to console log the error. And inside that function, we're going to make a request to our backend. So const res equals await. We're going to make use of Axios for that. So axios.get /API/or/current. So this is us talking to our backend API now. If there is a user present, we'd expect res.data. So res.data. So if there is data returned, it would be on the res constant, on the const res there, and it'd be on data.data. And what we're going to do, if there is data, we are then going to, so we've got the current user, we then want to do another request, because it's telling us that there's a user logged in. We're going to do another request to grab this user's axios.get current to-dos, API/to-dos/current. This means that we're basically grabbing all the data required to store in the state. So if there is to-dos.res, which we'd expect, to-dos.res.data, so if this comes back as true, if we have data here, if the user is logged in, then you'd expect res.data to go through here. Then you'd also expect to have some kind of to-dos or a response from to-dos. Inside of here, we're going to make use of dispatch here. So we're going to dispatch, it's going to be a type. So we're going to do dispatch, which is going to talk to our reducer. We're going to open up an object and we're going to do set type of set_users. Reducers on their types, typically we use underscores for spaces and capital letters. And then we pass in a payload, so we can use that on the reducer, and that is going to be res.data, which is this res.data up here, which will have all of the user information on it. We're then going to dispatch again. We're going to do a different type. And we're going to set up our reducer to allow to handle this data in a second. It's going to be called set_complete to-dos. And the payload there is going to be to-dos res .data.complete. And that's where in our backend API, when we do a call to /current, it returns us complete to-dos and it turns us incomplete to-dos. So I'm just setting our complete to-dos on the application equal to the response from the API endpoint. So I'm going to click save there. Prettier is going to format that for me. I'm going to copy and paste that again. I'm going to do the exact same thing for incomplete to-dos. So set incomplete to-dos. And it's going to be to-dos res.data.incomplete. And so I've basically got this set up so that we're going to dispatch set user and set complete to-dos if there's data. So I'm going to go up to our global reducer here. This is our switch case for that. You can see action.type. We haven't set up any cases here, so we need to set up a case we created one for set user. So case is going to be space quote set_user. So when we dispatch set user, we need to basically define what we want to do to the state. So we want to spread the state. So we want all of the remaining state to stay the same. So we're going to return in curly brackets .. state. So we're spreading the state. We're then setting the user equal to action.payload. This is the payload we set over here, which will be the user data. We then want to set fetching user here to false. So this will basically handle so we're now setting the user. So if we have a user, we'll set it there. We need to handle the type of set complete to-dos. So we're going to make underneath here, we're going to make a new case. Set complete to-dos. We're going to spread the state as we will always do in reducers. And we're going to do complete to-dos is going to equal to action.payload. And we'll be passing through those complete to-dos on the payload. I'm going to copy and paste this one. And we're going to do it for incomplete to-dos. So set incomplete to-dos. Set incomplete to-dos we want to do incomplete to-dos here. It's going to be equal to action.payload when we send that through. So that's brilliant. So basically, we've got everything to handle when we have a user set here. We also need to reset the state if there's no user returned from this get current user. So we need to basically, in fact, let's do it on the action first. So if we do a request and there's no res.data here, I'm going to put an else statement at the end. Dispatch. It's going to be a type of reset _ user. I don't need to put a payload here because I'm not going to have anything in the payload. It's just going to basically set our initial our state back to the initial state, essentially. I also need to do that inside the catch error. If there's a problem with any other requests, I also want to reset the users because something's gone wrong. So let's go back to our reducer here. A new case of reset user. I want to return and spread the state. I then want to set the user back to null. The complete to-dos to empty array, incomplete to-dos of this. And I'm also going to set fetching user to false as well because we're no longer fetching the user. We've tried to fetch the user. It's come back as we got an error. So that's all of that set up. So we've now got a nice get current user action here. So you can see it's grayed out. We're not currently using get current user. We need to return this. So on our const value, we're already returning the state. We also need to add get current user to our value. This then makes this function usable. We can use this in other components to get the current user. We can basically whenever we want to use the current use this action, we can use it in any component because we're now exporting it on the value, which is on the provider. I'm also going to make use of, so basically every single time the application starts or someone refreshes or loads up the page, I want to do an API request to get the current user. I want to see if there's an access token in the cookies. And if there is an access token, we need to set up and we need to provide the current data. So I'm going to make use of React's use effect. So that is a hook. The use effect is a hook where we can basically, we're using it as a lifecycle method here. So use effect, we're going to, inside use effect, we're going to make a arrow function as the first parameter, and the second parameter on use effect is what you want to listen to changes for. Normally you'd have like a value in here, so say you were waiting for the user. So every time the user changed, if you had a variable called user and if it changed, this use effect would be toggled. If you leave this empty, just with square brackets, this will basically run every single time the application, the component mounts. Seeing as this is a high order component, it will only mount once until you refresh, and every time you refresh, it will mount and whatnot. So we're going to, on the mount, we are going to use get current user. So if someone is already logged in, they don't have to go through the login process again. It will check their cookie and it will return the data. So if I open up, so now that I'm doing that, if I open up the console on our browser here and zoom in so you guys can read this, when I refresh the page, you can already see it there. You can see it's doing the API request here, get to localhost. It's trying to get the current user. It's unauthorized. So it will be doing this reset user here, seeing as we don't have the user, but it's tried to check if the user has an auth token available. Since it doesn't, it's now doing it's now just kind of carrying on as usual. So we also had a let's have a look. What else do we want to do inside of this tutorial? I think we want to have a look at, yes, okay. So inside of my layout component, seeing as our layout component, if we go to app.js, the global provider is wrapped around the layout component. So inside layout, what I want to do is I want to put up a loading message if we are still fetching the user. I don't want to show this login page if the user's logged in and we're just waiting for the data to come back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make use of, inside of our global context, we have initial state of fetching user to true. So inside of this component, I'm going to import, in curly brackets, use global context. Oh, that's auto-completed for me. Use global context from / context global context. And from that global context, I'm going to destructure from it, and I'm going to grab fetching user from use global context here. So what that's going to do is it's going to check our state, and it's going to return whatever fetching user is set to on our state. So by default, fetching user is set to true. As soon as the user is fetched, it's set to false. If there's no user present, it also sets it to false. So during loading, what I want to do is I want to make a check for, so where we're returning all of our browser router and what not here, I'm actually going to make a change here. I'm going to check if fetching user, I'm going to return a loading element. I'll put that inside the rounded brackets in a minute. If we've already fetched the user, I'm going to put colon, and we can return our browser router as usual. So I'm going to make a new div called loading, and inside there I'm going to have a h1 of loading. So if I refresh the page, it'll be a very quick flash. You see a quick flash there? It just said loading. Let me just I'm purposely doing the code wrong here just so I can show you. But during loading, we'll see this message here. So I'm going to open up main.scss. I'm going to do some styling for the .loading div. And all I'm going to do in there is min width 100 view height, min height. Oh, mid width should be 100 VW. Min height 100 view height. Display, flex, align items center, and then justify content center. So that's going to be our loading state. Obviously, it won't be appearing like that it normally is because I've got this purposely set up wrong just to show you. But if I set that to now, we will now see that loading message if we're waiting. It's a real quick flash, but we basically, if for whatever reason our API was taking a short while to return, we'd see a loading state, and then it would show the applications once it's tried to fetch the user. So we've allowed for getting the current user. We also want to allow for logging out. So we need to create a new action. I'm going to create a new action called const. It's going to be an arrow function like previous. Logout. It's going to be async. It's going to be an arrow function, which is an asynchronous function. I'm going to do the classic try catch. Console log the error. Now I'm going to try and log this user out. So if we're logged in, we need an option to log us out. So I'm going to do await axios.put, and we're going to make an API call to our logout endpoint there. Just going to open up the console again. Yeah, okay, let's close that. So we're going to do a logout. Back to the logout. I'm going to, if we've successfully logged out, I want to dispatch a type of reset user. So we're resetting to the default state essentially. So reset user. And I'm also going to copy and paste this dispatch. I'm also going to put it in the catch block. So if there's an error, if for some reason there's an error from this endpoint, we'll just reset the user anyway. So now that we've created our new action, I'm then going to also add it to the value so that we can use it elsewhere in our application. So I'm going to end the video there. Context can be quite a lot to get your head around. The idea of actions and reducers and whatnot is quite complicated. The way to look at it is actions are your kind of bulk functions. They will tell you what requests to make. They'll make requests to the backend and stuff like that, and they're more complex. A dispatch and a reducer is essentially, it's a simple way of interacting with the state without having to worry about all the other bulk stuff. So it makes it simpler to interact with our state. You wouldn't want to be doing complex functions inside of our reducer, but we will inside of our actions. So it's a lot to get your head around. There are lots of resources around global context. I also have a YouTube tutorial on global context and the context API on my channel already. It's a React movie watch list if you want to be a bit more familiar and you're not familiar enough. But in the next episode or next lesson, we will take a look at basically finishing off our authorization modal, our auth box, and making sure that we can wire that up to actually talk to our state. We can log users in and we can grab their current to-dos and whatnot. So I'll leave it there for this lesson, and I'll catch you in the next one.